there was a silencing. Us who experienced the genocide against the Tutsi, the world has somehow refused to hear us when we were crying for rescue. That was the first silencing. And then the second silencing was related to the fact that people said, and as they said for the Holocaust, that this is unspeakable. And in my experiences, it was rather unhearable. So literature is the way I found and the place I found to make our story hearable. So yeah, this is really about finding my place in the world.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the Royal Literary Fund's podcast about the craft of writing. I'm Sonia Faleiro and I'm so glad you could join us. Our guest today is a novelist, memoirist and poet whose work offers vital perspectives on memory and cultural identity. But first, let me briefly explain our format. Over the last decade, the Royal Literary Fund has built a remarkable archive of interviews, talks and reflections from writers across genres. Each episode of Collected features a guest responding to selected clips from this archive, allowing us to delve into the challenges and breakthroughs that shape a writer's life. Our guest is Beata Umubyeyi Mairesse, a survivor of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, when nearly 1 million people, primarily Tutsis, were brutally killed in just 3 months. Beata fled to France at the age of 15. Her debut novel, All Your Children Scattered, follows 3 generations of a family profoundly affected by the genocide. Her second novel, Consolée, explores the fate of Afro-Belgian children, known as the Métis, who were taken from their family under Belgian colonial rule. Her new book, The Convoy, tells her own story of escaping Rwanda via a Swiss aid convoy. Beata, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Our first theme is about the importance and ethics of telling personal stories. Let's listen to journalist, author, and activist Rahila Gupta, who talks about how writing shapes the writer.
Writing has turned me into a scavenger of human experience. I don't live life so much as I research it. I'm tortured by the ethics of scavenging. As my friend sits weeping in front of me, do my eyes register empathy or emptiness while I focus on what can be distilled from the present moment for a future project? I am constantly alive to an unexpected witticism, a poignant moment, a character revelation. My first instinct is to roll it round in my head and pin it down in my memory so that it doesn't disappear by the time I get to my notebook. While filling my car with petrol, for example, I watched a tall black man stride towards the shop with a little girl who clung to him around the waist from the back, and because she was so small, she kept bouncing off the ground every time he took a giant stride. Her mother sat in the car and watched and smiled indulgently. In my head, it became the perfect filmic moment, economical and wordless, of a father-daughter relationship. When I speak, I feel inarticulate. Because of that, I used to decline speaking invitations. I know audiences often take a shortcut. I know I do, and go to hear the author rather than read the book, especially if it's non-fiction. And if the speaking is an advertisement for the written work, then why do myself a disservice and put people off from buying the book? But in the act of writing, I grow to great heights. The muddiness that generally cloys around thought dissipates and leaves behind a pool of clear water. Even if the first words that I place on the screen jostle awkwardly with each other, I discover ideas, opinions, characters, and sometimes an unexpected and profound truth that I had no idea was lurking just below my consciousness. That transformation feels miraculous. I have no words to describe it. Writing has also helped me find my place in the world. Taking action to bring about political change has always been important to me, but I know my place in that process now. I don't aspire to be an inadequate orator or chant slogans or heckle speakers. I am the scribe, I record, I argue, I raise awareness, and I try to persuade others through my words. For myself, writing has given me equilibrium through its classic therapeutic function. When my son died, I wrote a monologue in verse which was performed across the world. It allowed me to bundle up my grief and place it in the hearts of the audience so that I could carry on living. Beyond the act of writing, it is the publication or production of it that transforms you. The first time an article of mine was published, I walked on air, head in the clouds for at least 6 days. It is an exhilaration that never quite diminishes when the work leaves the privacy of my computer and reaches out to the readers.
Beata, did that piece resonate with you?
Yes, especially with my last book, because I had to write about real people. It was not a novel anymore, and it was not making up characters. But at the same time, when she says that writing has turned her into a scavenger, I really don't feel like I was a scavenger, because there was a very ethical line for me not to cross. I made it clear from the very beginning that it was not only my book. I wanted to be a collective book. So after finishing the first draft, I sent to each and every person who is named the part where I was talking about him or her, and asked them to make sure that they were comfortable with it. All the children from the convoy were happy, and it was more the journalists or maybe the humanitarian aid workers who wanted to change some things because they were worried about the image of themselves. But this was really important for me to not harm them. So this point for me is quite different. And the other thing is that she says that she researched life. She doesn't live life, she researched life. And I will say that this also is different for me because I didn't plan on becoming a writer. And I first had to survive, and then I had to make my life. And I worked for years as a project manager in NGOs for a humanitarian program. And so I will say that I lived my life, I'm still living it. And then now as a writer, I kind of analyze it and try to share in an understandable way with people. But there are other things that really resonate with me, because she says that writing has helped her find her place in the world. And I will say that, yes, definitely it's the same for me. For me, I used to say that literature is a kind of a repair surface. There was a silencing. Us who experienced the genocide against the Tutsi, the world has somehow refused to hear us when we were crying for rescue. That was the first silencing. And then the second silencing was related to the fact that people said, and as they said for the Holocaust, that this is unspeakable. And in my experience, it was rather unhearable. So literature is the way I found and the place I found to make our story hearable. So yeah, this is really about finding my place in the world, taking action, as she said, for political change.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, we first met last year at the Berlin Literature Festival,
Yes.
where you gave the keynote at the festival on the 30th anniversary of the genocide.
Mm-hmm.
You said something really profound at the time, which I haven't forgotten, which is that although many people hesitate to ask about the genocide, survivors want to speak. Can you say more about why it is crucial for you to tell this story?
First of all, on every mechanism of genocide, as soon as it starts, there is also a revisionist or negationist discourse that starts. So speaking the truth and listening to the victims is really important to fight against negationism or revisionism. And also, I think it's crucial to hear the victims, because it's a healing process for them. I remember that during the genocide against the Tutsi, some killers will say, nobody's going to believe you if there are some people who survive. And this recognition of the harm done, of the crime done, is really important to find again a place in humanity. So this is really important for the people to listen and to understand and to believe. I don't think that this so common expression, never again, has any meaning now when we see what has happened since then and what's going on. But at least I want to raise awareness of what humankind is able to do. And when it's still possible to stop something, to stop any crime, to use the experience of the survivors, of the victim, is really important.
Are the students that you talk to able to draw a line from the circulation of misinformation all the way to violence and ultimately genocide?
This is what I try to teach them, and I'm really aware that most of the information they get is from the social media. And I really, most of the time when I'm in schools, I tell them, go to the library, ask the librarian, ask your teacher of history. Those are the people who can get you a real information. I really beg them to. Most of them don't read newspaper, but even listen to podcasts like this one or other source of information that are produced by real journalists, that people who are doing a good work, and not whatever they can find in the social media. Mm-hmm. And I understand that, because I think the role of a witness is really important. Sometimes they're not listening anymore to their teachers, they're not listening to their parents. But when I come into schools and I say, I was your age when I experienced that, and from that experience 30 years ago, this is what I can tell you. So they listen to me most of the time, then they're quite moved.
Is there one lesson above all that you want future generations to take away from your experience?
Be vigilant. All the time.
Beata, let's move on to our next clip, which is from the writer Andrew Cohen, and he talks about the emotional energy that is required of writers.
I've always been a slow writer, and I've always been an unhappy writer. These two things go together, I think, and what connects them is perfectionism, which can become a refusal to put anything on the page for fear of it not being irreproachable, in other words, perfect. With my first two novels, I wrote through this self-sabotaging impulse. I wrote them slowly, but I did at least write them. But with my third novel, Crustaceans, I simply ground to a halt. In part, my problem was that I was writing about a difficult subject, the loss of a child. So I was acutely conscious of wanting to compensate my reader in some way with crystalline prose, with the perfect book. Except that perfection is impossible, of course. It can't be achieved. I knew this, and yet I persisted in sitting down daily and writing nothing, absolutely nothing. I spent 3 years producing the first half of what is a fairly short novel, then 6 months producing nothing at all. And I was making myself ill. But there was a cure. It came in the form of Dorothea Brand's Becoming a Writer, which is premised on the technique of automatic writing, and that the idea that the writer is essentially two people, the artist child and the adult critic. If either is allowed the upper hand, trouble will follow. If the child dominates, there will be a mess on the page. If the adult dominates, the page will be empty. Successful writing depends on them working in tandem, which in Brand's scheme means automatic writing followed by revision. I'd never tried automatic writing before because it requires letting go, allowing for imperfection, for mess on the page, but I had no other options. So I sat down and wrote out a series of headings, the name of each of the characters and locations in Crustaceans, the main themes, the main plot points, and then for the next several weeks I practiced automatic writing. I went to my desk as soon as I'd woken, before my brain had begun to fill with the clutter of the day, when it was closest to the state of dreaming. I gave myself a set period of time, exactly an hour, Then I wrote without pause, pen on paper, whatever came to mind. No attempt at fine phrasing, no attempt to correct my punctuation, spelling, or grammar. I had permission to write any old rubbish, just so long as my pen kept moving. And of course I did produce a load of old rubbish. But in amongst it there was some shiny stuff, some fine phrases, plot possibilities, surprising ideas. But the biggest surprise was how much was inside me. A whole book was inside me. I just wasn't letting it out. That was the work of the child, to get it out. Then each afternoon I allowed the adult critic to rummage through the automatic writing, typing up what was usable, refining and revising. In 6 months I'd finished my book, and that's remained my method ever since. Whatever I'm writing, including this talk, I begin by pouring it out, no matter how badly written, how incoherent, and only then do I allow the perfectionist in. And I have to say, my perfectionist couldn't be happier.
Beata, the convoy took you years to piece together. It all began when some people told you that they'd seen footage of you and your mother on television, which led you to discover that a BBC crew had filmed the convoy. Can you talk to us about some of the challenges that you encountered while piecing together this book, which really reads like a very passionate and a very detailed investigation?
I like the thing that Andrew Cohen says about the fact that sometimes you carry a whole book inside yourself, and you just have to let it out. I was not planning to write that book at the beginning. When I started my quest, I will call that the quest of more than 15 years ago, I was just looking for an image, a footage of me from the BBC. So there was a BBC team that has been filming when we crossed the border between Rwanda and Burundi. And people told us that they had seen us on TV. So when I started that quest, I was just looking for an image of me and my mother crossing the border. And at that time, I was not even a writer and was not even thinking of becoming a writer, because I started writing quite late. I was more than 30 years old. So first of all, I was looking for an image, and then I found some images and given to me by two BBC journalists, Fergal Keane and Hamilton Wende. And I was not on those pictures. So I thought, I'm not going to do anything with those pictures. And one day, years later, I met with a young Tutsi survivor who told me that he said that he had been rescued by the same NGO. So I thought maybe he's one of the kids on the pictures I have been keeping in my computer for years, and maybe other kids are looking for those traces of their past. So I decided I will search for the list of the name of the children in order to bring them those pictures. So it was a very long quest, and I didn't find the list but eventually I found the man who had organized the convoy, Alexis Briquet, who was a Swiss humanitarian aid worker, and he died only 4 months after I had found him, which was a shock for me. So this is only when I decided to write the book, so in 2020. Because I thought, okay, this is an incredible story. Nobody has ever talked about it or written about it. And so I wanted to testify because there were only 2 humanitarian aid workers who managed to save hundreds and hundreds of children, and nobody has thanked them. So first of all, I started by thanking Alexis Briquet and his wife, Diana Cavadini. Then when I decided to write this story, I thought, okay, I'm a writer now. I have the tools, so I should be the one to do that if nobody else up to now has done it. And I didn't know how to write a nonfiction book. Each time, every book is, or every genre is a new adventure for me. I started by writing short story. This was quite obvious for me because I come from a culture, our culture, where we have kind of short stories. When I started writing novels, I didn't know how to write a novel. So I trained myself. I didn't go in any creative writing program. We don't have that many in France. But my process, if I can say that, is by making a plan, a very clear plan of what I want to say, how I want to, and the how comes later. And also I leave room for the unexpected. But the quest was still going on. I was still finding new people. I was still looking for pictures. And until the end of the book, there were new events or new information arriving. So I had to adapt and try to find how I'm going to present them. And even after the publication of the book in French last year, new people were found and new photos were found. And even right now, I'm really very, very happy that the book is out in English now, because I know I'm going to reach another audience, Anglophone audience. And for me, it means I'm going to reach other children of the convoy. So that's a whole process. It's very special experience. It's really different from the novels. When you finish a novel, it's finished, and most of the time there's nothing else to create unless you want to write part 2. But for this book, it's a living book.
It's so profoundly moving to hear about your process, and also the fact that you were able to build this community of children who are in that convoy.
Yes.
What were some of their reactions like when you first got in touch with them, or when they first saw you talking about the convoy?
They were moved, and I was moved too. Like the first presentation I did in a Librairie Gallimard in Paris, the end of the presentation, there was this young man who came, and he showed me a picture that I had posted, and he said, you see this little boy there? This is me. And I was crying, because I didn't expect this book to bring us together so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went in Kigali last year at the exact anniversary date, June 18. And then we were around 15 children there meeting. Some of them knew each other, had worked together, but they didn't know that they had that history in common. So they were,
That's
you were
incredible.
also in the convoy. So it was quite extraordinary. And most of them are thankful, because I brought them the book, and they said, even those who are, who have been in school in English, and they said, this book is like something that my children are going to inherit. This is our story written somewhere.
I want to go back to something you said earlier on when you were talking about the different genres that you work in, and the fact that you're a self-taught writer. You say you never studied writing, but you have an innate ability to tell a story. And in fact, as you told your readers, it was a story that saved your life while you were in Rwanda. Can you recount that episode for our listeners?
Yes, it's my little boy who is 10 years old who told me, when I told him the story of how I survived with my mother, he said, "Oh, this is the first time you became a storyteller." So in 1994, the genocide started in April, beginning of April. And so for 2 months, my mother and I, we were living in the south of the country, in a city called Butare, which is the second city of Rwanda. We had to hide. And so we spent 2 months moving from one hiding place to another, mainly in a hotel complex that was built during the colonial time. And this explains why there were, for example, basements, and we managed to hide for sometimes in a basement where the killers couldn't find us, because there are no basement in traditional Rwandan house. So the militiamen were not seeking for that kind of hiding place, but it was very humid, and I started having breathing issues. So we had to go in a hotel room. But unfortunately, beginning of June, the killers found us. We think that people told that we were there. I don't know how many they were. Probably 15 or 20. They were like a big group of militiamen. And so they were going to kill us. But the first thing, when they broke the door and entered the room, and they saw me, they shouted, "There's a white girl here." Because you can't see that in the podcast, but I'm of mixed race. My father was Polish, but I was raised by my mother only. But for them, a mixed race person is light skin, white. And so when they were about to kill us, at that moment, I made up a story. I hadn't planned that. So it was really on the spot that I thought, if they think that I'm white, so I'm going to pretend to be French. The reason is that even if I was only 15 years old, I was quite aware of the political situation. And I knew my mother was always listening to the radio, and I knew that France was a support for the genocidal regime from the Rwandan regime that was organizing the genocide. And also I had been in an international school since my childhood, so I spoke fluent French. And as I had this light skin, I pretended not to speak Kinyarwanda, which is my mother tongue, which is the language in Rwanda. I identified one of the men in the group of killers who was not carrying any weapon, because the other were carrying weapon covered in blood. And he was very clean, no weapon. And I thought, okay, this man must be the leader of the group. Probably he speaks French because he has to be an intellectual. And so I talked with him and I say, I don't understand. I don't speak Kinyarwanda. I'm French. My father is French, which of course was not true. But I made up a father and I made up a name, and I even, which is quite completely crazy when we think about this today, I even threatened him, saying that if they killed me, François Mitterrand was like the former French president, will be very angry and will withdraw his support or something like that. And it worked. It worked. I was very lucky that day.
That takes us to our next theme, which is on emotional well-being. Here's Martin Sketchley talking about how he finds a balance between writing and looking after his mental health.
As I write, it's mid-January 2021, and we're in the middle of lockdown 3. And with the COVID-19 crisis ongoing, many people are finding themselves a year into working from home. Many of them may have said at some point, "I'd love to work from home." But having suddenly been forced into doing so, they might now be realising what writers have known for a long time. When you're surrounded by your work, it can be difficult to switch off. That separation is not only healthy, but essential. One of my greatest personal difficulties is not knowing what to do in my free time. During the week, my life revolves around work. This is just like everybody else, I guess, but because I'm a writer, I've accepted, and it could be said embraced, the fact that my work is my life. My work defines me, gives me context, validates all the sacrifices those around me have made over the years to accommodate my ambitions. Without writing, I am, well, what am I? Recently, I've become much more aware not only of the importance of switching off, but also the benefits of doing so. That the unconscious mind can really make a difference. I'm just emerging from the longest break I've taken from writing since I started in the early 90s. While partly enforced by a house move, this was also due to some level of burnout and lack of success, not entirely unrelated factors, I imagine. Over the past 30 years or more, I've pretty much consistently jumped from one project to the next without pause. I once even took a laptop on a family holiday and got up early to write. What kind of holiday is that? Not only was I still working, it could be argued that I wasn't entirely with the people I love for the rest of the time. My work ethic and my desire to succeed have influenced everything. But like any complex machine, the mind needs to be well maintained. Any athlete will tell you it's during the recovery time that muscles rebuild. that it's during those periods that the training really pays off. I'm no athlete, but I now recognise the importance of taking my own recovery periods, that it's okay, essentially in fact, to stop thinking about words now and then, to give myself permission to take a break, that it's okay to binge on the Queen's Gambit, browse YouTube, or just look out of the window. With COVID-19, millions of people are now finding themselves juggling work and homeschooling kids with laptops on dining room tables, and with that, the need to achieve a good work-life balance and the importance of this to good mental health is becoming increasingly apparent. So whether or not you're feeling stressed when this eventually goes out, whether the COVID-19 crisis has eased or you're wrestling with the creative project, give yourself permission to take a break now and then.
Martin Sketchley on taking a break and recovery time. You know, Beata, I hesitate to ask women writers about how they deal with things because we are often asked, how do you deal? How do you manage? How do you balance motherhood and writing? And we're not often asked about our craft. But I think in your case, it is a question worth asking because the works that certainly I've read that have been translated into English, they come from a personal experience that is rare among writers and profoundly traumatic. Given that so much of your work goes back to that seminal moment in your life, can I ask how you manage to sort of step back and look after yourself when you're dealing with this one constant?
When I heard Martin Sketchley speaking, I thought, oh, he's talking about me. Not on the side of my work is my life. No, I really try to separate both in the sense that I didn't have to give up anything from my family life for literature. I gave up my career because I stopped working, because I realized that, you know, you can't have it all at the same time. But I really feel the same when he says I have jumped from one project to another without taking a pause, because during the last 10 years, I have published 8 books, which is a lot. And now I'm working on a new project. So I really need now that I need to take a break, but I can't yet. And as for the mental health issue, you are right. It's tricky sometimes. And the thing is, what is quite funny is I worked on mental health issues before. I was a coordinator of the suicide prevention program in my region in France. And I'm still a trainer for mental health first aid. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you say, I don't know how you say this in English, like the shoemaker is the one who has the worst shoes. I tell people that they have to take a break. They have to separate work from life, and I'm trying to work on that for myself. I still have this therapy going on. I take care of my mental health. I do yoga classes. Things like that are important for everybody, I think. It's not like as a writer. And I'm always happy when I can write about, not happy, but it's important for me to write about other things than the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. For example, my second novel, Consolé, has nothing to do with that story. It's, of course, it's also related to me because it's about the mixed-race children during the colonial time. And of course, this as a mixed child. And I knew that if I was born 20 years before, I would have been sent on this orphanage in Rwanda. But it was a different story. I could do some research and craft something new. And the book I'm working on right now has nothing to do with the genocide against the Tutsi. Because at one point you become like the witness. And this is something I don't want to be, to carry all that on my shoulder. And for me, a way to deal with that is to help other survivors to be able to write their book and to testify. With 2 friends, one in Canada, one in France, we have launched this auto-support group of survivors helping others to write their book and publish it. So for me, that's a way also to escape this responsibility to be the one who talks on behalf of the others, which can be very heavy to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the convoy, you make it very clear that this is a shared memory. It's a shared story. And we see and hear the voices of other survivors as well as the members of the humanitarian convoy. And therefore, it becomes a collective memory that you're contributing to. I don't see you centering yourself in your stories at all.
But sometimes the media would like to center the story on one figure, and really I try to resist that trend and say, I want other people to be heard, I want other survivors to be published, and I'm willing to go sometimes into the shadow and be and help them, but not be the one on the stage.
I mean, given that you live and work in France, you have a family there, you publicize your books there first, and the fact that France was complicit in this shocking violence, what kind of reactions do you get?
It's really easier to talk about this nowadays than, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago, because France has done real work on its history. And for example, 3 years ago, there was a report by historians, and this was something asked by President Macron to work on the responsibility of the French state during the genocide against the Tutsi. And this report stated that there has been, in France, they say responsabilité lourde et accablante, so very heavy responsibilities of the French state. And after that, the President Macron went to Rwanda to acknowledge that. So there's a process going on to recognize this responsibility and to open the archives, because years ago there was real clear denial from the French state, but now time has changed and things are better, which is not the case, for example, in Belgium. It's another story going on. But for France, things are being said and there is no more denial. But it took 20 years before we got there.
Beata, I want to move on to our next clip. It's a conversation between the novelist Carolyn Brothers speaking with our producer, Anne Morgan, about what fiction makes possible when dealing with certain political subjects.
I think there's an emotional core at the start of each book that's out there. And I do sometimes reflect on this, why can't I be a writer who sits and imagines a character and a situation? But for me, the inspiration has to come from, it seems that I'm very driven by things that I encounter in the real world. That's just how it's fallen out till now. But for me, it was very much a question of finding a new audience for subjects that had been, especially when it came to immigration, that had been so polarizing, and that it felt like there was a real need for a very human debate or human understanding of the situation, and not just looking at immigration from a policy or an ideological point of view. So I felt that fiction could get in between the lines. And it was a very interesting process, actually, because even people that are most adamantly against the strangeness of others and the invasion that they feel they're under with immigration, these people, when they read a story like that, are still able to be moved by the human side of it. And so I felt it was very important that we remember really what it is that we're talking about. So I felt that fiction could perhaps bring the reader closer to remind the reader, I think, of their human values and what it is we're really talking about. I think that was what it was.
Because I remember actually when I met you, it was a key day. It was the day the Brexit referendum results were announced, and we were both going to do a reading. And actually it was in a part of the country that we knew had voted leave. And so we knew that the audience probably had a number of people in it who had those views. And of course people voted for leave for all kinds of reasons. But I remember thinking it was very interesting watching you reading from Hinterland and talking about the refugee crisis and seeing the emotional effect that your writing had on that audience. It was a very extraordinary thing, I think, a really powerful thing.
I think that's the contradiction that we come up against. I was very nervous about that reading because I felt like immigration had been such a touchstone in that whole Brexit debate, and had been very divisive. And I think people, perhaps they feel they have a bit of a conscience about it. They know on one level that they may feel overwhelmed, but on another level, when if they'd encountered an Afghan child in their village, in their street, they probably would have been the first to take them in under their roof. It happens that way, that people can cope with the individual, but they can't necessarily cope with the bigger picture. And that, in a sense, that's what politicians do. They deal with the bigger picture, and they don't get close to the small individual lives. And that's the big difficulty I think we have in our societies, is trying to reconcile these things. I wish I could have seen the faces. I think I was concentrating so much on the reading, but the questions were interesting. And there was sort of a bit of a sheepishness, I think, that they hadn't expected the vote to go the way it did. And it was a very strange atmosphere, I felt, a strange time, but also good, I think, to remind people that there are these issues and that, they can have a human response to it. And no matter what their politics are doing, there's still room for individual action, and just to be reminded, I guess, of the human side of all these things.
Beata, you write across memoir, poetry, short stories, novels. How do you decide which form best suits the story you're trying to tell?
Oh, this is a great question. I will say that the subject will decide the genre. For example, when I started writing, it was clear for me that the short story will be the best genre, because I wanted to show how our lives, the lives of survivors, because the first short story collection is about women's voices, how they were cut metaphorically and literally by this event, by the genocide against the Tutsi. When I arrived in France, people were really, back in the days, very welcoming, very friendly. I had a foster family that was wonderful, and I was in a school where I could go in a boarding school for free for 3 years. But when it came to talking about the experience, I could see that it was hard for people to hear it, to listen to it. And even when I started trying to give testimonies written by witnesses or by survivors, people tell me it's too hard. So I wanted to find something that was a way to make it hearable, to make it closer to people, because I realized as a reader, I've been a reader since childhood, and literature had made me feel so close to people from other centuries, other continents. I knew that literature had this power of erasing the distance, erasing the borders. And when you read a testimony, you can feel empathy for the person, but you don't always identify yourself with the person who is testifying. Whereas when you're reading a fiction, there is this identification process that is very powerful. And so that's why I decided to write short stories, but also fiction. And I was very comfortable with fiction because I thought those are universal histories about motherhood, about friendship, about relations in families, intergenerational transmission, things that people from all around the world experience. But little by little, I will bring the reader on the edge of the genocide history.
Well, I can think of very, very, very few writers who work across multiple genres and do so in a way that shows their expertise in every one of them. But you're one of those writers.
I don't think so. Most of the times, I really follow my instinct, and it's maybe at the end of the first draft, and most of the time I only have one draft, which is, I feel lucky up to now because all the publisher had taken my first draft, and I didn't have to make a lot of changes. But it's like, it's instinctive. Poetry is something different. Poetry is my safe space, and the place where I can talk about everything, because it's very metaphorical, because there is something else going on there. Poetry is like a respiration, a breathing space. So even if I have not published a lot of poetry collections, I know I still need to go back to this safe space and breathe and sing and dance, and I can do everything there.
I do have to say that you've annoyed a lot of writers listening to the podcast by saying that your publishers accept your first draft.
Up to now. I don't know what's going to happen next.
That's not going to land well. I want to go back to a point that you made about technique and how you focus on technique in order to get readers to imbibe these stories, some of which come from the genocide and therefore from a very, very dark place. Can you speak more about the nitty-gritty of putting together your bigger works?
There's a friend of mine who is a writer who said about my first novel that it was a real Rwandan novel, in the sense that there was as much in what is not said as in what is said.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the English is right, but the Rwandan language in which I was raised, in which I grew up, is a language when we use a lot of images, a lot of metaphors, and we don't say everything. Even if I write in French, I always come back to our way of saying things, of telling stories, that is very soft. And this was quite surprising for foreigners who came in Rwanda even after the genocide, to see how people seemed calm about everything. Of course, there are moments, for example, during the commemoration, when the trauma is too strong and you can see manifestation of this violence. But otherwise, we always have this soft and calm and smooth way of saying things, even the worst and the most difficult things. We have a lot of proverbs, maxims, metaphors, and this is where I get a lot of inspiration, not only in the ideas or in the images, but also in the writing, I think.
It's a good segue into our last theme, which is navigating multiple identities. Let's have a listen to writer Kapka Kasabova on the challenges of moving between languages and cultures.
People always ask, where are you from? Or, the more culturally permissive, where is home? The two questions are on the surface quite different. One is about the past, the other about the present. One is about origins, the other about choice. But they worry me in the same way because I have always, since childhood, longed to be elsewhere. So where do you belong? People want to know. Where is your place? Where is my place? I wondered, aged 8, as I stayed up late reading Scarlet Sails by Alexander Green. It's the story of a girl waiting for a mythical ship with scarlet sails to appear and take her away. Green's escapist stories were set in places with fantastical names, which is why you wouldn't guess that he never made it out of Soviet Russia. I stood on our concrete balcony on the outskirts of communist Sofia and surveyed the thousands of lit-up squares of high-rises. Not a scarlet sail in sight. Tinkling with trams and punctuated by Orthodox churches, the Sofia of my childhood lived in the shadow of chestnut trees and late totalitarianism. It held onto its Belle Epoque remains under the onslaught of brutalist architecture and big-fisted proletarian monuments that very soon became chipped, just like our block 328, where my sister, me, and my mathematician parents lived as normally as we could. We had a Skoda, and my father spent weekends lying under it, while my mother made birthday cakes without flour, milk, or sugar. From where I stood on the chipped balcony of block 328, the world was coloured patches in the atlas, radio static, something that happened in books. The trick was to imagine that you were somewhere else, somewhere in the pages of, say, Pushkin's Eugene Onegin and Jack London's Call of the Wild. In other words, you learned to practice internal emigration, which meant that in your head you were somewhere else. Then the Berlin Wall suddenly fell, and in the rubble of the Cold War, our family was catapulted in an unexpected direction, the West, or rather, down under, where an academic job materialized for my father. Now, in my atlas, New Zealand was 2 small splashes at the bottom of the Pacific. Clearly, magic was imminent. There were going to be palm trees, dolphins, smiling natives. New Zealand was going to be just like my illustrated edition of Robinson Crusoe. We waved goodbye to everyone we knew, crossed the timeline on a one-way ticket, and arrived at the bottom of the South Island with a container full of books and a piano. The news hit us instantly. This was not the tropics. It was actually snowing. And the people looked like sunburned Scots. We were at the end of the world. For years, we huddled together and just got on with the business of survival, as emigrant families always do. And yet something was missing. It was as if we'd stepped off a cliff and were floating in some Pacific Ocean carpeted waiting room to the afterworld. Through my late teens and 20s, I wrestled with the feeling that my real life was unfolding elsewhere, far from here. Suddenly severed from my past, I felt unable to construct a future. Cut off from my mother tongue, I was beginning to write in a language and literary tradition that was alien to me. In my unseemly haste, I became stuck between languages. I had let go of Bulgarian, but I couldn't really go anywhere in English. I became speechless.
Beata, you write about an editor who once remarked about the subjects of some of your books. That niche is already taken. And at a public event, a friend who was hosting you on stage asked you the question, why do the bios on your books all say that you're a survivor? Is that your occupation? How do you respond to such comments?
It was really harmful. It took me years to be able to answer that. I think I did in my book. But when I talk with other writers who come from the South, I realize that we are summoned to justify our existence as writer. We have to always say, why do you write in French, for example? Ignoring that French people asking, why do you write in French? I ignore that French is an African language now. Of course, it's a colonial language at the beginning, but now it's a French language. And the majority of the Francophonie, the people speaking French, are in sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a question of legitimacy, always. And of course, I know that as a woman, this question of legitimacy is there for all the women writers. It has been there for a long time. But coming from Africa, being a woman, being a survivor, I spend a lot of the time explaining about that. But then it's also an interesting experience, I think. And for me, now I'm all right with that. Because since childhood, I have always been different because of being mixed race. When I was in Africa, they called me white. When I arrived in Europe, they called me black. And so this made me search for voices, for writers who had worked on those issues. So I'm fine with that now. I also feel free sometimes to say, okay, I don't want to answer that question. Or, those kind of questions say more about the person who asked them than about the person who is being asked the question. But what I found interesting in Kapka Kasabova words is when she says that, like the city, the Sofia of her childhood, lived in the shadow of chestnut trees and totalitarianism. And for me, this is something that is really very present in my first novel. The Butare of my childhood lived under the shadow of the jacaranda trees and of racist dictatorship. But her moving to Australia was, I think, more exotic than my moving to France, because I didn't have to change the language. I was completely fluent in French when I arrived in France. What was quite funny was that I spoke a more kind of classical French than the French teenagers, because, in Rwanda, they were still teaching old-fashioned French, and I had a very Catholic education. So when we were working on poetry or texts from the 19th century, I was the one who could understand what was going on because of the religious things. So sometimes it's interesting to see French people realizing that part of their culture exists in a very remote place, and someone from that place can remind them of that. In France, I'm not considered that much as a French writer, but abroad, French will consider me as a French writer. It's funny, having those different identities. But as a friend of mine once said, instead of not being well seated between two chairs, you can sit on the floor and be very comfortable with that.
I love that. That brings us to the end of this episode. Beata, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sonia.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.